Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Big T, Little T podcast. Today's episode is going to be a power exploration into the world of anti-oppressive practice and trauma-informed care, really how those practices can intersect and help with the complex journey of mental health recovery. And we'll be talking a little bit more about eating disorder recovery as well. Today, our guest is Romy Wakil. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Tisha.
And Romy is a wonderful therapist who I've known for many years. We've worked together for, gosh, I wouldn't, how many years?
I think we worked together for a couple of years, but we've known each other for around 5, if not longer now. Long time.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
go way back.
We go way back. And so I just know that you're going to bring, a wealth of experience to this conversation. And yeah, I'm really, really excited to explore, particularly the more anti-oppressive side of therapy, because I think it isn't something that I often see spoken about, and I know how important it is. So I'll let you start by really introducing yourself.
Okay, so as you said, my name is Romy Wakil. So I am originally from the Middle East, specifically from Lebanon. I grew up in Cyprus and I've lived in the UK now on and off for, oh my God, like over 10 years. It's a long
Wow.
time. So I'd studied here, I went back, worked in an anti-discriminatory NGO in Cyprus, and then I've been in London for around 6 years now. The way I like to introduce myself is by using the social graces. So I am a white passing woman in my mid 30s of Lebanese heritage, of Arab ethnicity. I would say middle class, able bodied. And I am an anti-oppressive psychotherapist. I work in an eating disorders clinic and I work in my own private practice. And I do work with asylum seekers, and I'm setting up a group now for my people for Lebanon as well.
Oh, absolutely amazing. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And so tell me, what led you to do the work that you do, and also in the way that you do it?
I think for me, one of the hardest things, so I come from the land that I come from is Lebanon, and but the land that I grew up in Cyprus, and both of those lands are lands that were colonized, one by the French and one by the Brits. And in my education in Cyprus, there was a lot of that colonizing mentality was really present of, if you do really well, let's get you to either the UK or France for your education, which is really, really interesting. That was kind of drilled into my mindset from a very young age. Important to think about this also when we're working with clients, because I'm the daughter of first generation migrants. So that the idea of, you're provided with a lot of resources. I was provided, I'm going to own my shit as I tell my clients. So I was provided with a lot of resources growing up that my family didn't, in many ways, growing up in the war. So going to the UK was seen as this, idealized place of education. And whilst I'm very grateful for all the education that I received here, I think I found my psychotherapy training really difficult in Scotland. I didn't see anyone who looked like me. As I said, I'm of Arab ethnicity. I found that the trainings that I was doing was all white Western therapists that I was being, taught about. And it was very white, westernized at the time, Eurocentric, pre-Brexit, and very individualistic, where my culture, which is very collectivist and very based on community, at times was seen as codependent, which I think is quite fascinating, because if we think of group therapy, it's actually putting a community in the room. So I started feeling really uncomfortable. I found myself I found myself in a space that I had been almost like working towards getting into my whole life, and quite disappointed at how the system wasn't decolonized, and it really pissed me off. And I wanted to do something about it.
Yeah. And you know what, as I'm hearing you speak, literally speaks to my heart. Like the way that you describe your experience, of course, everyone has their own individual experiences,
Mhm.
but just hearing it can, I'm sure people listening in will feel similar. It can be so affirming just to hear things
Mm,
like, what people see the Western world to be like, this is some holy grail that one must strive for. And
mm,
even you talk about the privileges and privileges that you had, that your
absolutely.
parents didn't have, and things like that. And just thinking about, what it is to be a daughter, a child of migrants.
Michael.
And yeah, so thank you so much for that. So just for anyone who is new to this term,
Mhm.
anti-oppressive practice, can you explain what it means in the context of therapy, and why it's important?
Yes. Um, so anti-oppressive practice. So let's take a moment and think about the word anti for a second.
Sure.
So anti has movement to it. So that's why I say I'm anti-racist, right? Because it's a movement. It's constantly in progress. And because of how embedded discrimination is in all, systems, unfortunately, it's a never-ending movement. I think if you step into this kind of work, there's almost there has to be, the idealist in me has had to sadly kind of recognize that I'm never gonna get there because of how embedded, colonization is in so much, with the education system being at the forefront of everything. So anti-oppressive recognizes it's a consistent movement. And here I have just a definition that for me, it's about working under the framework of allyship. And I think that is really important. And for me, allyship is recognizing, my layers of privilege as an ally, as well as making space for the layers of oppression that I carry in my body. And I say I carry in my body because, I know you and I both work with eating disorders. We both work in a trauma-informed way. And the body is, the site of all these memories and all these stories that we hold in our bodies. But also, it's really important to think about the bodies that we come from. Our mothers were our first home. Our mothers' bodies were our first home. So my first home was a Lebanese body, if that makes sense. And just
Absolutely.
thinking about the intergenerational stories that get passed on, that I think sometimes because of white supremacy and because of white fragility, sometimes there isn't room in mental health spaces to have stories, to have a safe space of witnessing the stories of oppression, the stories of colonization. So for me, it is operating under the framework of allyship, recognizing and challenging systems of oppression at a systemic level, at an individualized level, both intrapersonally. So what are, the internalized beliefs that I carry myself, as well as how it plays up interpersonally. So for example, with you and I, how do power dynamics play out between us? Um, and it's about ensuring that people that inhabit all bodies, and I feel so passionately about this,
Hmm.
feel seen and heard, inclusive of gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, faith-based beliefs, and developmental and acquired disabilities. Big
Absolutely.
task, Keisha. It's a
It's a big task, and no one can do it by themselves. And it is that, like you said, that is that collectiveness that is
absolutely.
so important for humanity, isn't it? And when you're doing any sort of anti-oppressive or anti-racist work, would you say that there are some key principles that come to your mind when it comes that you follow, key principles or foundational concepts that come to your mind in doing this anti-oppressive, in running an anti-oppressive practice?
Yes. Um, One for me is, I think, one of the main anchors, I like to call them anchors, that I think about is ethical, how to do this ethically. I think that, and I recognize this as quite a powerful statement and provocative, which I recognize as the role that I play very often with pride. Um, if we can, as therapists, sit and honor the power that we carry when sitting in the therapist's chair, and if we can't think as therapists about what we might symbolize, and if we can't do our own work and work through our own discriminatory beliefs, I don't think it's ethical practice to be working with clients that, you know, have experienced any form of feeling marginalized in society.
Yes.
I feel really, really strongly about that. Um, I think there's an element of emotional safety that is really, really needed. That is at the body-based level. So as you and I both work in this way as well, we both work in a very body-based way. And
Mm-hmm.
there's an intuitive knowing that happens in the body when you're sitting across from someone. And I think that that is always at the forefront of my mind. I think about cultural humility as another core anchor of mine. So I don't claim to know all cultures in the world, obviously. But when I come across someone who is from a culture that I don't know enough about, it is my role to go and educate myself and not
Mm-hmm.
theirs to educate me on their own culture. It happens way too much in therapy where clients are educating, clinicians on their cultural based beliefs, and that's quite frankly unacceptable. Go do your reading.
Yeah.
And doing it collaboratively is really important. This is something, as any, justice-based movement or a movement that challenges inequity, it doesn't work on your own. So for me, it's about mobilizing groups of people sitting, and I run a lot of reflective anti-discriminatory spaces, and it's actually incredible to watch what happens when you get a group of, practitioners in a room and we really work through our shit together.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it's about cultural humility, collaboration, transparency, and ethical practice.
Absolutely. And how would you say that that the an anti-oppressive
Mhm.
approach complements or even enhances the trauma-informed approach, and particularly in terms of ED recovery?
Okay. So let's think about eating disorders for a moment.
Sure.
So the way that I've worked in this field for a very long time. And I remember a client once asked me, like, why do you work with eating disorders? Because I work with eating disorders and I work with war survivors. And I told that client that is because I believe in freedom. I think, if you trace back my history, it makes a lot of sense, right? And I believe in internal freedom as well as external freedom. And with an eating disorder, I think we're working with people that feel really, really trapped in their body. And if we think about that for a moment, that is so, so painful because the body is the one home we can never escape. But what an eating disorder offers, as well as, addictions as well, so alcohol, drugs, is it offers an escape from the feelings in the body. So when I'm working with clients in an anti-oppressive way, which I just think is who I am as a person, it's just rooted in me, is I think about the stories in their body. I think of Resma Menakem and his book My Grandmother's Hands, which if anyone hasn't read, I really recommend they do, because it's all about the stories that are carried. And he calls them bodies of culture, which I think is really beautiful. So black and brown bodies, and the need for witnessing those stories. So I've worked with many clients who, when I've tried to make space to look at internalized racism, have been met with a lot of resistance and I don't know what you're talking about. And actually, over time, we've come to the realization that the anorexia was a way of whitewashing and a way of trying to fit into, the concept of what is considered beautiful. If I know you can't see me, but I'm doing quotation marks of
Quotation marks.
quotation marks of that thin white blonde girl. And you know so the lack of representation. I also think about stories of intergenerational trauma that get passed along. So often when I'm working with clients in an anti-oppressive way, I'm really interested in the maternal lineage. And actually, what happens, what we realize, is that there are stories of oppression that are carried through these bodies, through the maternal lineage, whether they're stories of, you know, war survival, whether they're stories of sexual abuse, whether they are stories of, racism, discrimination, slavery, all of these stories that are passed along.
Mm.
And in order to bear witness to those stories, I think really importantly, there needs to be a safe relationship between the therapist and the client, where the client is going to feel like the therapist is going to be able to hold those stories without white fragility. coming into play.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, I was thinking about something you said earlier as well about how you like to own your shit as well. So I
Yeah,
do wonder, and we talk, like you said, you and I work very similarly, and
yeah.
I do, I'm always tuned in, not always, I'd like to think always, but I think most of the time is a true answer, tuned into what's going on within my body and what sensations
Mhm.
and feelings are there, and what that might be telling me. How do you stay attuned to your own biases and privileges, and how does that help you maintain an empowering and safe space for your clients?
So, yeah, I mean, it's a process. Um,
Mm.
I have, two incredible supervisors that, again, are anti-oppressive and, actually, interestingly, come from stories of migration themselves. So I think there's a knowing and there's a shared understanding there between us. I think the political plays a huge role in my work and in my story. I think that I have done a lot of work and continue to do a lot of work of thinking about how the political enters the room. I'm an Arab woman. I mean, there's a lot of political turmoil where I come from. And, I've grown up in Cyprus, and Nicosia, the city I grew up in, is a divided city. So there is a lot of political narratives, both in my body, and in the lands that I've been in. And I think that shows up in my work, actually. And I really hold myself to account. Sometimes I don't notice it, which I think is important to recognize. And that's why I have such safe supervisors that call me out when I'm not recognizing something is happening. Um, and I think that I'm also learning my limitations. I think I'm recognizing when if I haven't yet worked through something, am I able to hold a safe enough space with a client? I don't think therapists talk about that enough. And I think
Mm.
that level of humility is really important. Um, that's a big question. I would say that I've been in therapy for 10 years and counting. I would say that there is a reason that sitting in the chair of vulnerability as a client has been incredibly enlightening and humbling to recognize the work that I have been and continue to do on myself.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm in a session and something comes up and I recognize it's my own stuff, I I think I've done enough work on myself so far to recognize it, put it to the side, and then work on it. Does that make sense outside the room?
Absolutely. Yeah.
But sometimes what happens, which I think is equally as important, when you have a really kind of safe and established relationship, I think sometimes there's been incredibly beautiful moments with clients where we've spoken about what we both might symbolize politically, what our bodies might symbolize to each other, and what it's like to have us in the room together doing that work. I think when those conversations happen, when there's a really safe, established relationship, they can be some of the most incredibly moving pieces of anti-oppressive work.
Sure. And it sounds like you being on the other side, so on the other side of the therapy room, sitting in that chair in that place where you can be vulnerable, you've done that work and continue to do that work on
Yeah,
yourself for over a decade now.
yeah,
Um,
long time.
a long time, which I think is incredibly important. And because, like you said, this is ongoing, isn't it? We don't get to this place of and we're done now. Here, our work is done. It's a constant. I
Yeah,
want to say battle is the word that comes to my
yeah,
mind. That we're constantly, and I also feel like it's. I feel often like I'm pushing against when doing any sort of anti-racism or anti-oppression
yeah.
work. And so, knowing what it feels like to be
Mm,
sat in front of a therapist and knowing what challenges that come up for you,
hmm.
what challenges do you see that comes up in your clients in terms of recognizing that internalized oppression that they might be carrying, and how do you support someone in navigating their way through that?
So I think sometimes what happens is I think the recognition of the internalized oppression that, my client might have is really, really difficult if they don't feel like there is a community that is going to bear witness to that.
Mm.
So I'm thinking about when you work with a migrant, There's something really interesting that happens across generations. So the first generation migrant, so often has kind of, there's a sense of acceptance of I'm new to this land and I'm never going to be fully embraced by them. It's really sad, but it's true. I see it a lot, especially with, I say migrant, but also I see it with this, I'm very, very passionate about working with refugees
Mm-hmm.
uh, because I care so much about freedom. I see that happen there a lot as well. Of there's a this country is giving me is giving. There's a constant battle with the system that's never ending, but their children, the second generation, is going to grow up feeling, let's take British for an example, is going to grow up feeling British, but their parents hold another culture. So there's almost
Mm.
like it's difficult, isn't it? Because that person that you're working with from the second generation is almost tackling two different cultures at the same time. They're going home to one culture, and when they go to school, it's a very different one. And that's
Sure.
when, and I think we're still in a space of assimilation in the world. I don't think we're in a place of belonging. I think there's still that idea of I need to mask parts of myself. For example, I'm not going to bring to school, you know, my, I don't know, my foods that my mom makes because nobody else around me is going to be doing that. They're going to be eating sandwiches and crisps, but that's not what gives me solace, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think when we're working with clients that are of that generation, it's really, really difficult because their own families have internalized those feelings of oppression because there hasn't been enough distance yet, or that there hasn't been the privilege, I would say, of being given the space to do the work to explore that. If I
Yeah.
think of my own story, right, if we go back to the beginning of this chat, I spoke about the, glamorization of, studying in the UK. And again, I'm very grateful to everything this country has offered me. I need to clarify that. I've met some of the coolest radicals ever in this place. There's really great people here and a lot of great work happening on the ground. But the education system and mental health spaces have a lot of work to do because that colonizer attitude is still quite present in spaces. I don't know if I answered your question.
You gave an answer. I think you did, first and foremost, I will say, but also just can I just say I love having these conversations. It reignites my passion for the work that we do because sometimes it can feel very lonely, can't it? Because it
Yeah,
does feel like you're pushing against so many different
yeah,
systems of oppression. And so when I have these conversations and you just hear from someone else's perspective and you're having sort of a two-way conversation, it
yeah.
really ignites my passion for it all over again. So can I just say how grateful I am for this conversation?
Well, I think that's
Um,
why you and I are so connected, right? I think,
it's true, and even you talking about you mentioned something earlier, which I'm definitely gonna. That's one of the first things I'm probably gonna research when we get off this chat is the
yeah,
maternal lineage as well. It's something
yeah.
I'm very interested in, and talking about what it is to when you have to assimilate. There's another word that I know I can't think of it right now, but when you're trying to adapt is the word I can only grab right now into a dominant culture when you are part of
Yeah,
another culture, which
yeah.
can be so tricky. Yeah, and you do end up having to mask parts of yourself. And I love the food example that you gave. That's
Yeah.
something that I can definitely resonate with myself, but also in knowing in my having lived in born in and grown up in London where like
Mm,
so many different cultures here, and remembering the different foods that colleagues bring into work and
hmm.
people at school bring into work, and different people's reactions to that, which I
Yeah.
find very fascinating, which can just be so invalidating and like you said, disconnecting a person from something that brings them so much soulful joy. There's nothing better than my mum's cooking in my opinion.
I
Right.
agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's the piece of, I mean, if I miss home, I'm eating Lebanese food, like no question
Mm.
about it. It offers the smell of I was making tabbouleh yesterday, which if you don't know, please go find it because it's like one of the best salads ever.
You need to
I'm a
get to know.
fattoush girl. There's like in the Arab world, it's either you're a fattoush or a tabbouleh girl. I'm a fattoush girl, but anyway, I was making only Arabs will, well, maybe Arabs and people who love Lebanese food will get this bit, but the smell of the parsley that I was cutting,
Mm.
I was thinking of my grandma, and I just like that smells take us spaces, And if we think about eating disorder recovery for a moment, if we're offering sandwiches and crisps to clients all the time in ED treatment centers, then we are not doing the fundamentals of the work that we are working with, which is working with what food symbolizes to people and what food offers the body. You know, when we think about trying to reestablish somebody's relationship to food and just even the practice of cooking as well, and the memories that that can take us to.
Yeah, or like you said, like even just the smell. And
No,
even you saying the word parsley, I could smell parsley. Do you know, that's how beautiful
yeah,
it is. Like having just how intuitive the body can be, and how just
yeah.
imagining an
Belonging.
experience, you could almost be there. Like you can, like, I can smell parsley
Took
now.
me back. It took me back to the flat
Yeah.
in Beirut. And I guess the longing, I think longing is important when we're working in anti-oppressive work. I think we really need to bear in mind that we are working with longing, longing for a
Mm.
sense of safety, longing for a sense of feeling seen and held and witnessed. I mean, at the moment, as we're having this conversation, like the queer community in Lebanon is really, it's really sad what's happening. There are so many attacks happening on the queer community in Lebanon, and I just want to name that, you know, when we're talking about anti-oppressive work, we're talking about race, we're talking about ethnicity, we're talking about gender identity, we're talking about sexuality, we're talking about, you know, what it's like, physical and mental ability.
Yeah.
We're talking about class. And I think I want to, sex, gender. I think we're also talking about intersectionality,
Sure.
which I don't think people talk about enough. Where I
Mm-hmm.
think we think about privilege and we think about oppression, we think about how these two parts interplay. So that's a lot of work for clinicians to do, but that is what we need to be educated on. I'm sorry. Like those are the
Absolutely.
nuances that we need to be equipped to doing this work. Mental health therapy is a very white middle class profession, but actually, you know, some of the most therapeutic conversations happen in community in villages when you're speaking to the matriarch and you're talking to them about what you're going through. You know, that is where
Mm.
the concept of sitting in a room with the door closed comes from. It comes from community-based spaces. So I just want us to honor the roots of that. Anyway, I'll stop there with that.
No, yeah, I'm sold. I'm like,
Where is that?
show me this person. Um, so you something you I've got this thing about as you speak, then dots start to
Yeah.
connect, and I go back.
Okay.
Can we talk about ED recovery and the Kristen
Yeah.
sandwiches? Right,
Yeah.
not specifically that, but that being one example of systemic oppression and how that can be upheld within a mental health structure. So who decides what
Yeah.
challenge meals that clients get and who decides what goes on the menus, and does that mean then that certain clients don't get to explore
Yeah.
certain foods and then certain meaning behind those foods and things like that? What other examples of systemic oppression do you see within the mental health space, particularly again if it is eating disorder recovery as well, if we can speak a bit more to that?
Sure. Well, I think that we need to think about faith for a moment, faith-based
Mm.
beliefs. Um, I feel like in the UK, there's a lot around Christmas, and I mean, I'm a person of faith, and I love Christmas, but not everybody celebrates it. So, you know, what are the spaces that are being offered for, you know, Judaism, for Muslims, for Buddhists, you know, for all there are Hindus, there are so many faith-based beliefs. And
Mm.
actually there's a lot around faith and food and faith and community. And I don't see that being honored enough. And I think sometimes I think it's important to say sometimes this isn't an intentional, the invisibility that exists, which is oppressive, because in essence, invisibility I find is oppressive, right?
Mm.
If you don't see my ethnicity, you don't see me. It's like when people say I don't see race, like I can't even. I'm like, so you don't see the person you're working with. I mean,
Literally.
you know, literally. So if we think about the importance of visibility, I think that many of these spaces are not coming from an intentional act of wanting to disregard, but it's the privilege that comes with, if you haven't experienced marginalization, you are not going to, it makes sense, right? You're not going to think about what do I need to, how can I create spaces where others will feel seen and held? Because often when you walk in to spaces, people look like you, people think like you. People might regularly eat sandwiches. I mean, sandwiches are becoming symbolic of a lot here, but do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so I think there's a lot here around faith, how we work with families as well. When we think about families and ED recovery, you know, for some cultures like mine, it's not just my immediate family. There's a whole crew, you know, of people. Um, how are we making space for that when we work with clients? And we're another thing that I find sometimes doesn't happen in ED recovery is, I think in ED recovery, and to be honest, all forms of recovery, there's a lot around, which I agree with, how do you assert your own needs, right?
Yes.
How do you make space to vocalize and verbalize and negotiate your needs with the people that you love? Unfortunately, when that messaging is coming from a solely individualistic lens, it doesn't create enough space to think about. For example, I come from a collectivist culture, so of course I need to make space for my own needs. But one of my primary needs is, how do I serve my community? And sometimes the Western way of thinking is serve yourself. But it's like, no, no, but serving myself is serving my community. So if we think about, for example, when we work with cultures who, you know, what's ingrained is you take care of the elderly. You know, you have your parents in the home and you look after them. If that isn't, you know, I've worked with a lot of people that have told me in previous care settings, they've been told that this is really taking a toll on you. Try and see if you can, you know, how can you unburden yourself from that? And I've been told by people like that is counterintuitive to who I am as a person. So it's dangerous when we're only viewing it from an individualistic lens only.
That's I think that's a lot of speechless. A lot of what you said there resonates, and even you just talking about. I wrote down here faith and food because that's such a good
Yeah,
point in and of itself.
yeah,
There is a lot of focus on Christmas. I'm definitely guilty of that myself, and yeah, not a lot of thought around, particularly needy recovery. I think the big one that I often think about as well is I think it happens in most religions. At some point, there is a fasting that might go on, and having to
yeah,
support different clients through those different practices that come with their faith. So yeah, I think food and faith is such
yeah,
a weighty topic that can just hold so much through many different
absolutely,
cultures and religions.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, if you think about the forms, the assessment forms, when we're asking questions around food, what are the questions that we're asking? You know, like what are clients restricting food on? What are they binging on? What is this? Is there a cultural significance?
Yeah.
How do we, there's a lot sometimes of, I was thinking about, I did a talk with a boarding school once on this, on the importance of anti-oppressive kind of values. And I was told that a lot of Asian students were ordering in a lot. And I was like, what do you think they're communicating? Like, make their food, please.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it hadn't even been thought about. And I actually, one person had said, but they're in the UK, they, you know, it's helpful for them to also eat British food. I said, absolutely, but also this is, there is a direct request for something that a child is making that is being ignored. How beautiful would it be if, you know, in ED recovery, in schools, you know, kids could, or clients could give the chef a recipe, a family recipe to make. What would that be like to share that with the community? Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean? I can
Yeah.
see a smile as I say that. Like
I love that.
it's
Yeah.
beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah.
It is, and even just that, that experience at the boarding school of them recognizing the importance of them having British food, but like you said, that invisibility, not also recognizing the importance of eating their own cultural foods as well, and how
Yeah.
actually many of these children, like myself, we are of different cultures. You know, I
Yeah.
am of British and Caribbean culture, so both these foods mean a
Means
lot
something
to
to
me.
you.
Yeah, but they
Yeah. Of
both do. So it's not like all of one or the other. It's like they
course
both mean
not.
something. So
Yeah.
it's interesting that only one of those cultural foods seemed important in that particular,
Exactly.
and that's where the whole systemic
Yes.
oppression. Yeah,
Comes in.
exactly, absolutely. Are there any resources or initiatives or readings that you could recommend to anyone who is new to this and maybe wants to start looking into it? I'm thinking about therapists and clients here as well.
So I have a few books I could suggest. I would say there's just one piece here that I think is really important.
Sure.
I think that this work is primarily process-based versus intellectual.
Nice.
So I think reading can only take us so far. I think the real work is when there is a community of people that come together, that, contract together and sit and explore, guided by a facilitator. I run these groups all the time, and it's really important that they're guided by someone who can hold the safety there, but that the processing is happening. I think we can read, and there's amazing books I will suggest. I think we can read forever, but unless we're engaging from the neck down, our bodies, and the feelings that are coming up when we're doing this work, I don't think the movement is going to be as authentic.
No,
Like
absolutely.
with our clients, right? Like when a client comes in with a pen and paper, I'm like, this isn't a class. Like we're working on your feelings, and when a feeling lands in the body, it will stay there. Um, so I would say the biggest resource is look for spaces that are anti-oppressive, that are guided by a facilitator that's there to do that work with you. There are so many amazing movements that are happening on the ground. There are really cool radicals doing this work. Find them and then bring the learnings into the systems you're in, and let's create like a movement for it.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of books, so a fellow colleague of mine has been part of a book called The International Handbook of Black Community Mental Health, which is amazing. You have My Grandmother's, so that's Karen Carberry. You have My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. White Fragility, which everybody, Robin DiAngelo. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, which I have right here. I mean, most of these books I have literally behind me. In the Name of Identity, just to give a Lebanese, writer, Amin Maalouf. Black and British, David Olusoga. Black Issues in the Therapeutic Process, Isha McKenzie. This is a book that was actually suggested to me by when I was working in the anti-discriminatory NGO world. He was really cool, and it was cool. It's in 2007, but I have to say it's still relevant to this day. It's by Drozdek and Wilson, Voices of Trauma: Treating Survivors Across Cultures. Really important book. It's been kind of like a solid one that I always go back to. The Social Graces by John Burnham. So I when I do this work, these are the social graces are always at the forefront of my mind. So age, ethnicity, race, class, employment, gender identity. Gosh, there are so many. Ability, like mental and physical. There are many more that I haven't named, but really reading up on the social graces. They, Them, Their, A Guide to Non-Binary and Genderqueer Identities by Eris Young. Polysecure, I think is important to think about. Consensual Non-Monogamy by Jessica Fern. It's Not About the Burqa, Mariam Khan. Supporting Autistic People with EDs, Kate Chanturia. The Good Ally by Nova Reed. I mean, those are just a few. I could go on forever, but I think that's enough for now. But one thing I would say, Keisha, that's really important, is because I get this question a lot of, my gosh, there's so many different forms of oppression. Where do I start?
Yeah.
I really don't want this work to be tokenistic, because trust me, clients can pick that up a mile away, and they're not dealing with that kind of bullshit. So I would say think about the piece that's most important to you as a person and start there.
Yeah.
Do it do work that's meaningful to you. Start with that. Think about what's the piece that you never thought about that you're really, really blind to. There might be a reason for that. Look at that. Start with something that's meaningful to you and take it from there.
That's such good advice. And I think, yeah, as you was listing off all those books, I was like, I want all of them. But classic response from me, but also
Yeah.
recognizing that actually there's going to be certain identities and things like that that you think, do you know what, I've not ever explored that or thought about that invisibility again. And maybe that's I had a conversation with a wonderful woman called Nicola Haggett, and she would talk about our edges. So the stuff that we haven't recognised within ourselves or worked on, that maybe that's the edges that you need to be looking at. But
Yeah.
I think always, if you're a practitioner, looking at your own reflective practice, looking at certain conversations that you're having within your week, both inside and outside of sessions, and like you said, doing that processing work, so either doing that in community or making sure that you're taking that time to do that reflective practice as well. I think that is really important. And then you can see
Mhm.
yeah, where it is that you need to go that bit deeper, that little bit
And
deeper.
my clients have been my biggest teachers ever. And for
Absolutely.
that I will forever be grateful. And, you know, I really, really work on establishing a safe relationship where they can call me out. And when they do, I really take it seriously. And I go
Mm-hmm.
and I do the work I need to do to bridge whatever gap. And I'm sure there are pieces that I haven't named in this conversation. And if there are, I'm always open to hearing about them. But it goes back to, I think we only know what we know, and we need, I think that's why this work has to happen in community. It can't just happen through reading, because
No.
I've seen the beauty of doing it in groups. And actually it really is when others call out others that I guess the learning can really kind of move even more, like can progress even more.
Yeah. Yeah. um and what advice then, because I think that then that just to looking at that being in community and the processing piece and how important that is, it's, I've been there. It's so easy, you can find a book on most things
Yeah,
nowadays and feel like you're doing the work, and that can be part of the work that you do, so don't be dismissive of
definitely.
that. However, the processing is so important, right? And sometimes that intellectualizing conversations like this can keep a person quite stuck.
Yes.
um, and for some people, therapy can feel scary, maybe due to past negative experiences and other fears that they may hold. So, do you have any words of wisdom, encouragement, or advice for anyone who may need to, go down the route of putting themselves into therapy, but maybe just feeling a bit afraid right now?
Well, I guess, what I tell my clients all the time is that I don't think therapy is comfortable, but I think it always needs to be safe. So look for discomfort, but not feeling unsafe. I
Mm.
think that you have take your time. You have the right to ask for what you're looking for. And I really, if we think about visibility and invisibility, think about the parts of your identity that you're going to need validating. And in your assessment or discovery call, ask. Ask any questions you need to determine whether, that therapist that you're having that conversation with has the capacity to meet you. I think that
Mm.
is really important. I think that the mental health spaces are a microcosm of the world that we live in. If you're stepping into a space and you're feeling a power dynamic and you feel like the person you're working with isn't going to be able to address those power dynamics, and a lot of your stories is around power, then maybe that isn't the space for you. It is okay for you to say no to a professional.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But sometimes we get it wrong.
Absolutely. And I know that you do a lot of work on the ground as well. Are there any organisations or initiatives or, spaces of advocacy that you'd like to just shout out and signpost here today?
Gosh, there are so many that I wouldn't know where to start. I think there are two organizations that I'm currently liaising with. So I'll give a shout out to both of them. So there's AMNA, which is this amazing organization that's where the asylum seeker work that I'm doing is. And there's Embrace, which is an amazing mental health NGO based in Lebanon. And I'm just in the process of, alongside another peer, getting a group therapy in place with them. So I'll shout out the two that I'm currently
Amazing.
liaising.
And of course, if there are any more that you think of, we can always add those to the show notes as well. But I think, this has been such a powerful conversation. My heart is warm, can I just say? My body is singing right now because, I mean, I'll be honest, there's actually a mix of emotions. There's some sadness there, looking at the work that it is that we do, and
Mm-hmm.
the challenges that come with that. But then there's also, so it's just so nice to know that there are other people out there doing that work as well, and that you are never alone. And that is the power of doing this work in community and having that peer support, isn't it?
And I guess, I think we both knew it quite early. I mean, I don't know. I think we did quite early on when we were working together. I think there was a shared understanding and a knowing that we're both very aligned in this. So to think that
Absolutely.
these years later we're having this conversation, like I find that really heartwarming. And I think when we find other clinicians that think like us, I think we just there's an element we want to stay
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
continue that. It's really, really important. So thank you, Keisha. And yeah, I hope we have more of these kind of conversations, and I hope this mobilizes people too. I really do.
I really do hope so too. Thank you, Romy, for spending the time to chat with us. Yeah, thank you so much. It's
You're
been a
welcome.
pleasure. Thank
Bye,
you.
Keisha.